Good morning, everyone, and thank you all so very much for your presence here as we come to give a briefing, an overview of our biennium budget for 2021-2022. Just one note of housekeeping. We need to make sure that we have seating for all of the members. So if you are a non-member and you're seated and we have members in the House who are standing, would you kindly give way to those folks, please? That would be very helpful. Thank you very much. Ann?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm hoping we can get this switched over to the PowerPoint here. Just to open things up, as you recall, the chairman set out his 5 overall priorities for the budget when he presented the House budget, and these were shared by the conferees. The 5 core priorities were enhancing our reserves as part of an overarching focus on structural balance in the budget moving forward, providing employee compensation increases for all groups of employees, being teachers, state employees, university faculty, and state-supported local employees. Ensuring college remains accessible and affordable for Virginia students, supporting strategic investments in areas like public education, health and human resource, environmental protection, and finally making workforce equity a priority in the Commonwealth. The next 2 slides simply show the revenue adjustments contained in the overall budget. You'll see you have a $13.7 million unappropriated balance at the end of the biennium. There were no revenues picked up that had not been included in the House budget as introduced, but you do see, of course, here the mid-session reforecast. But with that, I will hand it over to Michael, and he will begin with the area of compensation.
Beginning on slide 6, there's approximately almost $600 million for employee compensation. In the Conference Committee report, language does tie the release of and the authorization of the raises to meet the current year's revenues being within 1% of the forecast that's included in the Act. In addition, the funding for the universities is included in central appropriations, and they are treated identically to other state employees. There's $265 million in central accounts for state employees and state-supported locals. There's $290 million for teachers, which is a 2% raise in each year of the biennium, and there's $36 million within the agencies for targeted salary increases. The state employees, including the higher ed, will get a 3% bonus in the first year in December in their December 1st paycheck, and then a 3% salary increase effective at the beginning of the second fiscal year. State-supported locals would receive a 2% bonus next December, and then a 3% increase in the second year. Sworn officers of the state police would receive in lieu of getting the bonus, they would get a compression adjustment in the first year and a 2% across the board, and they'd also get the 3% in the second year. And as Zach will go on later, the teachers would get 2% in the first year and 2% in the second year. This slide just shows the targeted salary increases that are in the Conference Committee report. These were all included in the House budget in almost identical form. Funding for the benefit programs, the Conference Committee report includes about $8 million over the biennium to decrease the amortization period by 5 years for the State Employee Retirement Health Care Credit Plan. This will save about $288 million over the life of the amortization. The Conference Committee report also eliminates the funding for the 2.4% increase in the health insurance premiums that was scheduled in July based on the balances in the HIF, but retains the funding for the premium increase in the second year in case the HIF balances go down over the course of the next year. And the last slide just shows funding that is included in the budget pursuant to legislation that was adopted during the session. Giving to Tony.
In the area of higher education, the single biggest item I think you're going to see there is that the House prevailed on its moderation funding. There is, in the conference budget, there's about $121 million total of funds that will allow institutions to fund their 6-year spending requirements, do the 3% compensation increases that Michael was just talking about, and do all that without having to increase the in-state undergraduate rates. So it's more than just a moderation pool. So the amounts, as you see, is about $39 million in the central accounts for the 3% bonus. There's also adjunct money, which we don't have an estimate on that just yet, but it's part of the pool. There's the $10 million at Mason and at Old Dominion for general operating support. There was $3 million in there for Norfolk State for IT infrastructure upgrades. And there's $4 million in the first year also for the VCCS to do it for the advisors. And then lastly, there's the almost $55 million that's in the tuition moderation pool itself, that once it's certified that the institutions kept their tuition at the FY 2020 rates, that would get allocated. In the second year, there's $25 million there. That's a placeholder, in part because it's an estimate of the continuation cost of that first year. We still don't know who will exactly take part in the pool because it is voluntary. So next year when you come back, you'll have to take a look at that and see what that amount would need to be, and then have it allocated. So we may have to supplement that. Then in other items, there's $60.6 million for the in-state undergraduate financial aid. That's going to go further under a 0% increase. $2.5 million for graduate aid. There's $69 million for the G3 initiative, and that looks very much like the House proposal that you had adopted earlier, including $2 million for the outreach efforts. There's the second year of the Old Dominion and George Mason money is $12 million each. There's an additional $25 million at Norfolk State and at Virginia State, the largest of which is for that Virginia College Affordability Network. The money here will support student access and affordability. There's the second year, Michael's already pointed out, for the 3% raises. And then there's about $31.5 million for institution-specific items. $6 million of that, $2 million the first year, for the second is for the Radford campus at Carilion. There's $10 million for the Massey Cancer Center as well. As you see, in total, there's over almost $405 million for colleges and universities alone in the budget over the biennium. Extension, EVMS and centers, Jeff Labs, about $7.9 million, $1.3 for EVMS base operations. There's the extension money at VSU for about $3 million, 1.1 at VIMS for the fishery survey, as well as the disease management, and then $2.5 million at the various higher ed centers, and that includes money for a rural technology grant program that you adopted last session. At Chev, 17.7, the largest of which is $12 million for the TAG program. What was adopted for TAG was it phases in the award for online students. So new students coming in would not be eligible for a TAG grant. The existing students are grandfathered in. They would maintain an award at $3,400. For all other students, we do achieve the $4,000 grant in the second year, and there was no study language that was adopted. You see the other items there, $800,000 for the virtual library, and then some other items, the largest of which is that expansion of the internships. If you put all of higher education together, there's over $500 million in this budget for higher education. In other education recommendations, the online expansion for JMU, $2 million, funding for the arts, Jamestown, Yorktown, local library aid, and then some smaller items at the Museum of Fine Arts and the Science Museum. In terms of policy, there is language that allows for the out-of-state and enrollment flexibility. There's language that allows institutions to purchase under the VASCUP contracts, even if they're not a member. And then there are several reviews of higher education costs that were adopted as part of Chev.
All right, moving on to the K-12 portion of the budget. The conference report represents about $1.4 billion in new spending. That's $128 million in spending beyond the governor's proposed budget. With this budget, we can now say that K-12 expenditures have returned to inflation-adjusted FY 2008 levels. The conference report increases per-pupil expenditures by about 10% from the base budget to about $6,400 per pupil by FY '22. School divisions will receive about $1.38 billion in additional state aid in the upcoming biennium. This slide summarizes all the new direct aid that is proposed. About 60% of that, or $800 million, results from biennial rebenchmarking related to the SOQ. Another 20% of the new cost, about $290 million, represents the compensation increase proposed at 2% in each fiscal year. And about 10% represents increases to the at-risk add-on. As I mentioned previously, and Michael had mentioned, the 2% salary increases, there's one proposed for each year. To access the funds, the first 2% school divisions would need to provide at any time during the first fiscal year, and the second 2% they could provide at any time throughout the biennium. The upper range of the at-risk add-on is proposed to be increased from the current 16% add-on to 26%. Meaning the most impoverished school divisions would receive an additional 26% in basic aid payments per free lunch student. $46 million is proposed for increasing the school counselor ratio to 1 to 325 by the second year, and another $21 million for additional support for English learner teachers. About $20 million is proposed to increase the cost of compete adjustment rate to 16%. This returning us to closer to the rate that it was prior to the recession. $10.6 million is proposed to eliminate the cost of breakfast and lunch for free or for reduced price lunch eligible students. And another around $8 million is proposed to help small school divisions absorb enrollment loss, and as part of a hold harmless, no loss package to ensure school divisions experience no reduction in state funding from the prior biennium. A total of over $100 million is proposed for early childhood initiatives. The state recognized cost for VPI slots is increased by about 10% each year for a total of to bring the total VPI recognized cost to about $7,600 per slot. $10 million is proposed for a mixed delivery incentive for private providers to fill the gap between private preschool slots and public slots. There's also a proposed initiative to expand preschool to cover at-risk 3-year-olds as well. About $9.3 million is provided from VPI Plus slots that were unused last year, and these funds are provided to the administration to supplement any of the early childhood initiatives that may become oversubscribed as the initial implementation of the early childhood reforms begin. There's also $5 million provided, or $3.5 million provided annually for the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation to expand their pilot mixed delivery program, and another $8 million is provided to supplement recruitment and retention programs for hard-to-staff preschool classrooms. In the second year, the Federal Child Care and Development Fund, funds about $180 million, as well as the responsibility for child care licensure, will transfer from DSS to DOE, and language in the conference report would rename the Joint Subcommittee on VPI to the Joint Subcommittee on Early Childhood Care and Education, and expand the scope of that committee to provide some oversight for this transition. Moving on to lottery-funded programs, the conference report recognizes a rebound in lottery sales based on the ban of gray machines and the implementation of internet lottery sales of about $85.6 million. The conference report also provides an additional $20 million in general funds to ensure that 40% of total lottery proceeds can be reserved and dedicated to per pupil payments, totaling about $530 million over the 2 years. The supplemental lottery per pupil payments are renamed in the conference report to the Infrastructure and Operations Fund. This would ensure that $185 million is provided over the 2 years for school divisions to use on non-recurring expenses, including construction, purchasing land, school buses, as well as debt payments on construction projects. Several of these aspects were in place prior to the recession, including the minimum requirement to spend funds on non-recurring expenses, which will be set at 30% in the first year and 40% in the second year. There's also a maintenance of effort requirement to ensure that localities don't use these funds to supplant local revenue sources. And starting in the second year, the local match requirement would return as well. The conference report provides funds for several cultural and educational grant programs, including Jobs for Virginia Graduates, museums in Central Virginia, communities and schools, as well as the consolidation effort between Allegheny and Covington school divisions, and the Recovery High School that's proposed in Chesterfield County, and several others. In the central office of the Department of Education, funds are provided in the second year to support implementation of a statewide learning management system, following planning work that would occur in the first year. And about $500,000 is provided to the department to help implement bills passed during this 2020 session. And this summarizes the other language amendments throughout the budget. The first of which would provide 1 more year of staffing flexibility. The governor's budget removed this staffing flexibility language that's been in place since the recession. With this extension, the conference report also would request school divisions to provide information on how they use this flexibility. And there's also a provision that would remove the prohibition on the use of performance assessments for high school verified credits.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. There's just a couple of small items in House Bill 29, just some technical ones in the middle of the page where additional reductions were taken, $3 million in administrative balances, and just an update on expenditures to date. And then at the last item, there was a reduction in the transfer to the trauma centers. It does leave $5 million for the trauma centers in 20. Going into House Bill 30, looking at Medicaid, it does fund the forecast, as you heard earlier this session. The one largest item that was added in the conference report was $34 million for the coverage of adult dental benefits. And I think that's the greatest change right there. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. In terms of the DD waiver providers and the rate increases, personal care, there was a rate increase of 5% in the first year, 2% in the second year to help mitigate the costs of the legislation related to minimum wage. That's about $65 million over the biennium. That combined with the next item, which would provide overtime for personal care attendants up to 56 hours a week beyond the 40 hours a week. That's $19.2 million. There is the waiver refresh in 2 lines here, 43.4 for the group home, sponsored residential, and group day support. And then if you look down below where it says community integration and engagement providers, that also is a rate refresh for those, providing a total of about $51 million for the rate refresh. And then there was money put in for the skilled and private duty nursing of $12.5 million. Just coming down to other providers, I just want to mention briefly the psychiatric residential treatment facilities at $15.2 million over the biennium, nursing facilities at almost 14, plus with the 6 other nursing facilities below, that gives you about 16.5 total for nursing facilities. And I'll just move on to the next page unless there's any questions. In terms of DMAS and Medicaid savings, I just want to highlight a couple things here. The second line, it's a little over $40 million for the conference report, which adopts a 30-day hospital readmission policy consistent with Medicare and an emergency room utilization program. And then coming down, just House Bill 1291, I think there was a Senate Bill 5682 that saved about $8.4 million for the reduction in spread pricing for pharmacy benefit managers and the Medicaid managed care organizations. And then the conference report adopts the removal of the first-year funding for the home visiting benefit at the bottom. That does not harm the program. The program will be funded in the second year. DOJ settlement agreement, again, just at the top of the page, the only change there is recognizing the rate increases for the waiver providers, and that gives you about $68.8 million for the DOJ settlement agreement over the biennium. So let me skip to the next slide. STEP Virginia is largely unchanged. We just shaved off about $2 million in administrative costs. Still leaves the agency with positions to administer the program. In terms of community behavioral health services, this is about $92.1 million. First of all, there was a big expansion for permanent supportive housing that provides about $25.5 million over the biennium. It's almost doubling the program as it is today. There is $20 million for discharge assistance and $15 million for public-private options to divert or reduce state hospital admissions and hopefully bring the census down. And the others you've seen before, so I'm going to skip on. Behavioral health facilities, I will point out to you the first one. The conference report does phase out the temporary beds at Catawba Hospital. Entirely takes the dollars that were added in the governor's budget. It does leave them with some special revenue funds of about $5 million to phase back down to their current census, or their census before they started expanding. And in the previous slide where you saw some funding for census reduction and hospital admission and diversion, that money is going to be put in to help relieve the census pressure. So hopefully all the money that we're spending in the community will address the census. So let me skip on now to Department of Social Services. You've seen most of these, I think, just on the first slide there. I just want to point out that's a little bit less than what the House budget had for phasing in preventive service departments at local social services. Just shaves it a little bit more than the House did, but still should give them money to phase in and be successful. Going to the next slide. Just want to point out a couple things on this slide. If you go down to the middle of the page, there is about $11 million in general fund and some matching that should be non-general fund, matching non-general fund over the biennium to bring up the minimum salary for local social service workers and to provide a 1.5% increase to address salary compression. And that is in addition to the increases provided to the all state supported local employees that Michael alluded to. And then there is $1.5 million to increase the maintenance payments through TANF for two-parent families by 15%, and I'll just go over that briefly when I get to the TANF slide. And there's a little bit of money to plan the new child welfare information system, and then there are some reductions there, some backfills of administrative costs with CCDF block grant, and eliminating enterprise platform solution. That was a new item in the Department of Social Services. So going on to TANF, I'll just point out a couple of things. The conference report increases TANF benefits by 15%. That's 10% over what came in the governor's budget, so that provides you with about a little over $17 million each year. Coming down to the, you'll see calendar year 2020 summer feeding pilot program. There's money in 20 and only in 2021 to bring the summer feeding program to a one-year pilot, and we'll get an assessment of that and see how well it performs. Then community employment and training, this is a little bit less than what we had in the House budget, so it's 1.5 a year. There is continuation of the pilot project for LARCs and other contraceptives. This language on the LARCs mirrors what is in the current budget today. It does provide $2 million each year. For the hormonal LARCs, and then there's $1 million each year in TANF funding for other non-LARC contraceptives that are FDA approved. Community action, that's shaved a little from what the House budget was at 1.5 a year. And there's a couple things on the bottom of the slide there. Laurel Center, Lighthouse Community Center, those came over from the Senate budget and were agreed to in conference. And then, of course, we picked up the legislation that was passed this session. Department of Health, just going to highlight a couple things. In addition to the nursing preceptor program, which the House did, we also adopted the behavioral health loan repayment program. That's together, it's 2.1 each year. We picked up the legislation on the immunization of school children, and the Virginia House Bill 1015, that was Delegate Herring's bill on the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Prevention Fund. That's about $1.5 million over the biennium. One thing on the adult sickle cell services, which we had in our budget, the conference report also adds a patient assistance program. It's about $1.2 million total for those items over the biennium. And then there is legislation that got picked up for the COPN program in the next line, and right after that for lead and mold testing in schools and lead testing in child daycare programs. And let me just move on here real quickly. In terms of other health and human resource items, funding for the poison control centers over the biennium stays the same. It's just done a little bit differently. General funds in the health department the first year, some general fund and non-general fund in DMAS the second year to pick up an initiative that we're allowed to do under the federal government, and it gets some federal matching dollars in there in the second year. And then we picked up the legislation on the Office of New Americans, the driver's licensing program. That was a youth commission recommendation. And then there are a number of language items here. I don't want to read through all of them. I'm just going to point out a couple. There's language requiring the HERC to do the assessment of mandated coverage of hearing aids for children by JLARC and the Bureau of Insurance prior to implementation. The cap on CSA rates for private day special education services is removed in the second year, and it requires the state to set rates. And then there is language directing DMAS to exempt live-in personal care workers from the electronic visit verification requirements, and there's money in DMAS's administrative budget to take care of that. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, the health insurance reform, there was some language modified for the State Corporation Commission related to the health benefit exchange. Just want to tell you, we picked up the non-general fund that was in the fiscal impact from those bills. And then budget redirected the money for the reinsurance program and put language in instead directing the secretary to come back with a report that really looks at, to go ahead and begin the process of implementing a 1332 waiver, and reports back to the General Assembly on the costs and assumptions, and provides some draft legislation for you to look at next session.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, in the area of commerce, in the economic development incentive payment accounts, 3 items to note for you. The conference report provides about $1.2 million over the biennium for the Airline Service Incentive Fund, as well as it fully restores funding for the Virginia Jobs Investment Program, and then provides an additional $2 million for the Motion Picture Opportunity Fund over the program's FY20 base budget. At the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, the conference report includes an additional $7.5 million for the Business Ready Sites program over the introduced budget. In the Department of Housing and Community Development, the conference report includes substantial investments in the Housing Trust Fund, the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative, which focuses on broadband, as well as the Go Virginia program. In aggregate, over the biennium, these 3 investments total $195 million. The conference report also retains funding for a new eviction and prevention and diversion program at DHCD with a $6.6 million investment over the biennium. The Virginia Innovation Partnership Authority will replace the Innovation Entrepreneurship Investment Authority and the Virginia Research Investment Committee. To that end, the conference report includes comprehensive reporting language for the new authority, including an annual performance report to better understand the outcomes achieved by the authority as a result of the investments by the General Assembly, and quarterly updates to the committee on the transition into the new authority. In terms of the budget, a few major points I wanted you to be aware of for the new authority. It provides $35 million over the biennium for the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative, restoring a majority of the funding for that program. The conference report includes use of $20 million from the sale of the CIT building, which is non-general funds, for smart investments in the programs included in the new authority. Bottom line, the budget for the new authority includes an additional $6.5 million in biennial funding over the introduced budget. At the Department of Labor and Industry, the conference report invests $2.3 million over the biennium for 15 positions to investigate and enforce worker policies such as minimum wage, non-payment of wages, and worker misclassification. The conference report also provides 3 positions for a new Office of Offshore Wind at the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. The conference report also makes strategic investments in the Department of Small Business and Supplier Diversity to encourage and strengthen SWAM participation on state contracts.
Right, moving on to Ag and Natural Resources. For water quality improvement programs, a total of $76.3 has been deposited in the Water Quality Improvement Fund over the biennium. This includes $4.6 million each year for technical assistance funding for the soil and water conservation districts, and this has been moved to the core operating allocation provided to the districts. The conference report includes $15 million general fund the first year for the dam safety fund, and language directs that the funding be used for improvements to soil and water conservation district-owned dams. For land conservation, there's a total of $11.5 million each year. This includes $10 million for the Virginia Land Conservation Foundation, $1.25 million for battlefield preservation, and $250,000 each year for farmland preservation. For DCR, funding is provided for maintenance staff and preventive maintenance needs in the state park system. Additional funding is provided for the operation of Green Pastures Recreation Area, and there's additional operating support for Mason Neck, Natural Bridge, and Pocahontas State Parks. For DEQ, a total of $18.5 million in additional resources over the biennium has been provided for additional staff and equipment to support permitting activities, as well as the department's environmental justice activities. In DHR, $5.9 million is provided the first year for the museum and cultural initiatives listed here. Additional funding is provided to establish a permanent fund to support the care and preservation of historical African American cemeteries, and the conference report restores funding for the care of Confederate graves. In VMRC, a mix of general fund and bonds has been provided for oyster replenishment and restoration. At VDAX, the largest item is the Virginia Food Access Investment Program, which receives a $1 million capitalization the first year, as well as administrative staff support. At Forestry, funding's included to establish a new hardwood forest habitat program, and $400,000 each year is provided for the department's activities related to WIP 3. Moving on to public safety. For DOC, the largest items are related to inmate medical care. $27.5 million is provided over the biennium for increased hepatitis C testing and treatment costs. $9.4 million is provided for general medical inflation costs. There are a mix of general funds and non-general funds to support the department's implementation of an electronic health record system. $8.7 million is provided for UVA and VCU to operate 2 pilot programs offering medical services at 2 correctional facilities, and there's a $1 million deposit in the Corrections Special Reserve Fund. DCJS has a number of items. Most of these on this sheet, in fact, all of them were included in the introduced budget. State Police receives $3.6 million and 10 positions related to the several bills listed here, as well as $6 million over the biennium to implement the Community Policing Act. At ABC, amendments to both bills increase the general fund profit transfer by the amounts listed here. In the judiciary, sufficient funding is provided to hire an additional 100 deputy district court clerks over the biennium to begin addressing the workload issues. At the Indigent Defense Commission, funding is provided for 59 additional public defender positions across the Commonwealth, as well as to open a new public defender office in Prince William County. And at the State Bar, an additional $1.5 million is provided each year for additional civil indigent defense attorneys.
Mr. Chair, moving quickly through the area of general government, the conference report includes 3 additional positions for the Division of Human Rights in the Office of the Attorney General to implement several pieces of legislation adopted by the 2020 General Assembly. It also allows OAG to use an additional $500,000 in each year of funds collected and deposited into the Regulatory Consumer Advocacy Litigation and Enforcement Revolving Trust Fund. In the Administration Secretariat, one item to note in the Department of Elections is the conference report appropriates Virginia's Federal Help America Vote Act grant award, and it directs it towards the replacement of VERIS, the state's voter registration system. The conference report also includes several amendments for the lottery to support the implementation of iLottery, sports betting, and casino gaming. HB 29 and HB 30 extends lottery's line of credit to help them get started in implementing the provisions of gaming legislation adopted this session. In addition, HB 30 authorizes a Treasury loan and directs licensing fees to support the regulatory activities of casino, gaming, and sports betting.
Moving quickly to transportation, Mr. Chairman. The budget will reflect approximately $1.2 billion in additional resources for transportation tied to the legislation that was adopted during the session, primarily the largest one being $703 million for House Bill 1414/SB 890. And the second slide just shows the language amendments, significant language amendments in transportation. Most of these amendments were included in the House budget. There were 2 that were in the Senate budget, but not the House. The first one being the congestion mitigation program, which would provide $5 million a year for DRPT to reduce congestion in urban areas, and the requirement that the MEI Commission be provided a detailed financing plan for the Long Bridge Rail project prior to the execution of the MOU.
And in the area of capital outlay, Mr. Chairman, on House Bill 29, the items that you see listed, they were already in the introduced budget, the exception probably being the School for Conflict Analysis. We were able to get $4 million of VCBA and non-general fund to complete that project. In House Bill 30, the program itself is about $3.3 billion, all funds, $86 million of general funds, mainly for maintenance reserve. There is about $1.9 billion in public building and college building authority projects. That's a $500 million reduction from the introduced budget. There's about $600 million of non-general fund projects, mainly higher education and transportation. There's about $80 million in 9C bonds. That corresponds to the House Bill 1246. Those are dorms and dining hall type projects. And then $388 million in other 90 non-general fund revenue generating projects. Again, slightly less than the introduced budget. The major projects that are in there, $701 million. There's about 20 projects in the College Building Authority pool. You see the items that are listed there below. Another $228 million for Public Building Authority pool projects. The 2 biggest ones are the Fine Arts Museum and the Northern Virginia Science Museum project. In other major expenses, as I mentioned, maintenance reserve, about $274 million. $65 million of that is in general fund. There are project supplements of about $171 million, $109 for the equipment. and then some of the items that are listed below. $50 million in the stormwater, and then $50 million in nutrient removal and some of the water quality improvement, and then the Alexandria Phase 2 at $25 million. Also not listed, there's about $10 million of general fund to plan about 11 projects. And then lastly, in terms of policy, there's some language related to use of balances, and then just some technical language changes.
And Mr. Chairman, the last page simply lists those items that had not been included in either the House or Senate budgets. As you can see, they're enumerated there and are all language items.
Okay, thank you, staff. Thank you very much for the briefing. We appreciate it so very much. And this concludes our time.
Coronavirus presentation, and I know that Dr. Oliver, the health commissioner, is on his way and should be here in about 5 minutes.